The Appalachian Mountains loomed like shadowed giants against the fading sunlight, their craggy peaks crowned with mist. Tom adjusted the straps on his backpack, motioning for the group to follow. "This is it, everyone. The search for the Yeti starts here." Sarah rolled her eyes, smirking. "Sure, Tom. The Yeti. Next, you'll tell us Bigfoot's your uncle." Jake chuckled, but his laughter felt hollow, swallowed by the dense canopy above. Lisa and Marcus brought up the rear, their silhouettes barely visible in the growing gloom. The forest seemed to breathe around them, a living entity, its secrets buried in roots and shadows. The group had come prepared, state-of-the-art drones, motion sensors, cameras, and survival gear. It was supposed to be a thrilling weekend, blending urban legends with the thrill of discovery. But the moment they stepped into the forest, a strange tension settled over them. "Anyone else feel like we're not alone?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stop trying to scare us," Lisa replied, though she clutched her flashlight tightly. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder, the trees more twisted. Symbols, carved deep into bark, began to appear. They were jagged, almost primal, as if gouged into the wood by something more claw than hand. "What the hell is this?" Jake asked, brushing his fingers over one of the carvings. "Old folklore, maybe?" Tom guessed, snapping a photo. "Or some survivalist trying to scare off hikers." Sarah leaned in closer, frowning. "It's not just one symbol. Look, they're all different, almost like a language." Before anyone could respond, a low, mournful whisper floated through the trees, carrying with it a chill that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. "Who said that?" Lisa demanded, spinning around. "No one," Marcus replied, his voice shaking. "No one said anything." They stood frozen, straining to hear. But the forest had gone unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. "We keep moving," Tom decided, trying to mask his unease. "It's just the wind." But with every step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't carried by the wind. They seemed to come from the trees themselves, low voices murmuring in languages none of them could understand. And then they found the footprints. Massive impressions sunk deep into the muddy trail. Each one was almost 3 feet long, with clawed toes splayed wide. They weren't human, and they weren't bare. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, kneeling to inspect them. "Tom, tell me this is a prank." Tom's face was pale. "I didn't do this." Before anyone could argue, a sudden rustling came from the bushes. The group froze, flashlights aimed at the source. The undergrowth shifted, branches snapping, but no animal emerged. Lisa grabbed Jake's arm. "We should go back." But when they turned to retrace their steps, the path behind them was gone. Trees that had once been familiar now formed a solid, unyielding wall. The forest had shifted, trapping them. A cold wind blew, carrying with it a voice. Clear this time? "Lisa, is this your idea of a joke?" Marcus demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound firm. Lisa shook her head, her grip on Jake tightening. "Why would I joke about this?" "Then who?" Marcus trailed off as the voice called again, soft but unmistakable, weaving through the trees like a thread pulling them deeper into the woods. "Tom, we need to leave." "Now," Sarah said. She clutched her camera, her fingers trembling. Tom raised a hand to silence her, his gaze fixed on the motion sensor display strapped to his wrist. It beeped faintly, showing faint movement ahead. "Something's here," he whispered. "It's close." "Great. The Yeti we came looking for," Jake muttered, his sarcasm doing little to mask his fear. "Shut up, Jake," Lisa snapped. "This isn't funny." Tom ignored them and stepped forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The forest seemed to close in, the towering pines standing like sentinels, their branches clawing at the dim light. The motion sensor continued to beep, soft, rhythmic. Whatever was moving was close, but just out of sight. Then, without warning, the beeping stopped. "What the?" Tom began, but Sarah interrupted with a sharp gasp. The path behind them, the one they had been walking minutes before, was gone. Instead of the trampled dirt trail, there was only an impenetrable tangle of roots and brambles. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the pale light, mocking them. "This isn't possible," Marcus muttered. He pressed his hand against one of the trees, as though testing if it were solid. "I'm not crazy. This was a clear path." "It's the forest," Lisa interrupted, her voice rising in panic. "The ranger's story. He said the forest shifts. It traps you." "Enough," Tom barked. "Nobody panic. We have the drones, the cameras. We can use them to figure out where we are." He knelt and opened his backpack, pulling out a drone. The others crowded around him, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows. The drone's blades whirred to life, and Tom released it into the air. They watched the screen as the drone's camera fed a live video feedback to the handheld monitor. At first, it showed the canopy of trees, dark and endless. Then it rose higher, breaking through the thick cover to reveal the mountain landscape. "Look," Tom said, pointing at the screen. "We're not far from the ridge. If we head that way..." The feed cut out. "What happened?" Lisa demanded. Tom stared at the screen, jabbing buttons. "I don't know. The signal just..." A loud crack echoed from the trees above. The group looked up just in time to see the drone plummet, its shattered body crashing to the forest floor in front of them. "No way," Jake whispered. Something took it down. Before anyone could respond, the whispering returned. But now it wasn't soft. It was louder, closer, like a chorus of voices surrounding them. Words they couldn't understand hissed through the air, rising and falling in a strange, rhythmic chant. "Run!" Sarah yelled, grabbing Tom's arm. They bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The forest seemed to come alive around them, branches scraping at their clothes, roots twisting beneath their feet. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, as if the trees themselves were screaming. Marcus stumbled, falling hard against a tree. "Wait," he cried. But when he looked up, the others were gone. He was alone. "Guys," he called, his voice breaking. He turned in circles, his flashlight barely illuminating the encroaching darkness. "Tom? Sarah? Jake?" The whispering stopped, and then, from behind him, a low voice spoke his name. "Marcus." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an inevitability. He spun around, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, too still. "Who's there?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking. He held the flashlight like a weapon, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then he saw it, just at the edge of the light, a shadow. It stood impossibly tall, its shape indistinct but undeniably human. Eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of his flashlight. "Marcus," it said again, but this time the voice was coming from behind him. Slowly, trembling, he turned. The last thing he saw was a pair of glowing eyes, impossibly close. And then nothing. The forest swallowed him whole. Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa burst into a small clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering had ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence that felt even worse. They huddled together, scanning the dark trees with their flashlights, as though the beams could keep the forest at bay. "Where's Marcus?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Tom looked around, realization dawning. "He was right behind us." "Oh, no sarà vispedit. We can't just leave him." "We didn't leave him," Jake snapped. "He must have fallen behind, or the forest took him," Lisa said, her eyes wide. "Stop it," Tom barked. "We're not losing anyone else. We'll find him." "And how are we going to do that?" Jake asked. "Our drone's gone, the path disappeared, and the forest is literally screwing with us." "Shut up, Jake," Lisa hissed. "Both of you stop," Tom interrupted. "We need to stay calm and think." As the argument simmered, Sarah swept her flashlight across the clearing. Her beam caught something unusual, something man-made. "Hey, over there." They turned to see what she was pointing at, a dilapidated tent half hidden under a tangle of vines. The canvas was torn, flapping in the cold breeze. Near it lay a rusted camping stove and a crumpled sleeping bag, stained dark with something that looked suspiciously like blood. "Is this from another group?" Lisa asked, edging closer. "Looks like it," Tom said, kneeling by the stove. "But this stuff's been here for years." Sarah crouched by the tent, peering inside. Her flashlight revealed a small pile of notebooks and a weathered backpack. She reached for the nearest notebook, its cover smeared with mud, and flipped it open. "What does it say?" Lisa asked, leaning over her shoulder. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as though written by someone in a frenzy. The words leaped off the page. "The forest watches. The forest listens. Don't trust the whispers." Sarah's breath hitched. She turned the page. More frantic scrawls filled the margins. "The trees move. The symbols are warnings. They're marking us." "Marking us?" Sarah whispered, a chill running down her spine. She turned another page, this one filled with a single phrase repeated over and over. "This place is a trap. You won't find a way out." Jake snatched the notebook from her hands, flipping through it. "This guy sounds like a lunatic. Maybe he got cabin fever. Or maybe he saw what we're seeing," Lisa said. She gestured toward the backpack. "Check that out. There might be something useful." Tom unzipped the pack, pulling out an old, handheld recorder. Its exterior was scratched, the buttons worn from use. He pressed play, and static hissed from the tiny speaker. At first, there was nothing but white noise. Then, a voice crackled through, hoarse, panicked. "They're coming," it said. "They're coming, and you can't stop them. The whispers, they know your name. Don't." The recording cut off abruptly. Lisa backed away, clutching her arms. "This is insane. This can't be real." "It's real," Tom said grimly, slipping the recorder into his pocket. "Whatever happened to these people, they left this for a reason. Maybe it's a warning." Jake looked around the clearing nervously. "What do we do now?" "Keep wandering around until the forest picks us off one by one." "We regroup," Tom said, standing. "We find Marcus. We stick together. That's how we survive this." "And if we can't find him?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "We will," Tom said firmly. But even as he said it, his gaze flicked to the trees, where shadows danced just out of reach. Then, somewhere deeper in the woods, they heard a sound that froze them in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. "Marcus?" Sarah called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. The footsteps continued, moving closer. Louder, heavier. "Get behind me," Tom ordered, gripping a flashlight like a weapon. The others obeyed, their breath shallow, their eyes wide with fear. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Then from the shadows a figure emerged. "Marcus!" Lisa gasped. It was him, or at least it looked like him. He stepped into the clearing, his clothes torn, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes glinted in the flashlight beams, blank and glassy. "Marcus," Sarah said cautiously, "are you okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, as though listening to something none of them could hear. "Say something, man," Jake urged. "Where the hell have you been?" Finally, Marcus spoke. But his voice was wrong. Too soft, too flat, as though someone else were speaking through him. "The forest is hungry." And then he smiled. Marcus's smile was wrong, a jagged twist of lips that didn't belong on his face. The group stared, their flashlights trembling in their hands as his glassy eyes roamed over them. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" Lisa asked, stepping closer despite the growing knot of fear in her stomach. "The forest is hungry," Marcus repeated, his voice hollow. His smile widened, revealing teeth streaked with blood. Tom raised a hand to stop Lisa from approaching. "Stay back." "Why?" Lisa snapped, tears in her eyes. "It's Marcus. He's right here." But Sarah shook her head. "That's not Marcus," she whispered. "Look at his eyes." Marcus's gaze snapped to her, his expression twisting into something darker. "I can see you, Sarah," he said softly, his tone dripping malice. "You think you're safe, but the forest sees you too." "Enough of this," Jake said, stepping forward. "Marcus, stop screwing around and tell us what's going on." Before anyone could react, Marcus lunged at Jake with inhuman speed. He grabbed Jake by the collar and slammed him into a tree, his strength far greater than it should have been. Jake gasped, his flashlight falling from his hand and spinning on the ground, casting eerie, strobe-like shadows. "Let him go!" Tom shouted, rushing forward. He swung his flashlight, but Marcus caught it midair, his grip unyielding. He turned to Tom, his mouth curling into a sneer. "You can't fight it," Marcus growled. His voice was layered now, as though another, deeper voice spoke beneath his. "You've all been marked. It's too late." Sarah and Lisa screamed, pulling Tom back as Marcus released Jake. He crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, his face pale. Marcus stepped back, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "What do you mean, Mark?" Tom demanded, standing protectively in front of the others. Marcus tilted his head, his body twitching violently. "You've seen the symbols, haven't you? The carvings on the trees. The forest leaves its mark on anyone who enters. You belong to it now." "That's insane," Sarah said, clutching Lisa's arm. "We're not marked. We're leaving, and you're coming with us." Marcus's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You don't leave." "Not really. The forest always finds you." Without warning, Marcus turned and sprinted into the darkness, his movements unnaturally fast, his body contorting as he disappeared into the trees. No, no. Lisa cried. "We have to go after him." "No," Tom said firmly, grabbing her arm. "That wasn't Marcus. Not anymore." "What the hell is happening?" Jake groaned, clutching his bruised neck as Sarah helped him to his feet. "It's the forest," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "That ranger story about the forest keepers. He said they protect this place. They must have taken Marcus." "They didn't take him," Tom said grimly. "They turned him into something else." The whispering returned, louder now, pressing against their minds like a rising tide. The trees seemed to shift around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. "We can't stay here," Tom said, his voice urgent. "We have to move. Now." "Move where?" Lisa demanded. "There's no way out." "We'll find a way," Tom insisted. "We stick together, we keep moving, and we don't stop." The group huddled close, their flashlights barely piercing the suffocating darkness as they stumbled through the forest. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself were pulling them down. And all the while, the whispering grew louder, now distinct enough to make out words. "They will not leave. The forest is hungry. It is time." Lisa clung to Sarah, her breathing ragged. "It's inside my head," she whispered. "I can hear it. It knows my name." "Don't listen to it," Tom said, though he could feel the whispers creeping into his own thoughts, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Ahead of them, a flicker of light appeared, a faint, wavering glow, like a fire burning deep in the forest. "Do you see that?" Jake asked, squinting through the dark. "What is it?" Tom hesitated, his instincts screaming to turn back. But the group was exhausted, their minds fraying under the relentless pressure of the forest. They needed something, anything, to hold on to. "It could be shelter," Tom said, "or someone who can help. We'll check it out." As they moved toward the light, the air grew heavier, the ground slick with mud and rotting leaves. The light flickered erratically, as though beckoning them forward. But as they drew closer, their flashlights revealed what lay ahead. A circle of trees surrounded the source of the glow. Symbols had been carved deep into their trunks, glowing faintly with an unnatural, pulsing light. In the center of the circle lay a crude stone altar, its surface stained dark with old blood. And standing before was Marcus. He turned to face them, his expression blank, his hands outstretched. "The forest welcomes you," he said. And then the light went out. The clearing plunged into pitch-black darkness, leaving only the sound of their panicked breaths and the faint whispering that seemed to rise from the very ground. "Flashlights," Tom barked. The group scrambled to raise their lights, but the beams barely penetrated the suffocating gloom. The once bright LEDs now flickered weakly, as if the forest itself were draining their power. "Where is he?" Lisa whimpered, clutching Sarah's arm. "Where's Marcus?" Tom swept his flashlight toward where Marcus had stood, but there was nothing, just the altar, looming cold and lifeless in the feeble light. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "This place, it's wrong." "Stay calm," Tom ordered, though his own voice shook. We moved back the way we came, slow and steady. As they turned to leave, a deep rumble echoed through the forest. It wasn't a sound any animal could make. It was low, guttural, and seemed to vibrate in their bones. The trees themselves seemed to shudder, their branches reaching toward the group like claws. Then the whispering stopped. Why did it stop? Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a terrible cry ripped through the air, a sound so unnatural it sent bolts of terror through their spines. It was Marcus's voice, screaming in agony, but layered with something far darker, more guttural. The scream echoed in all directions, as if the forest itself were amplifying it. "Run!" Tom shouted, breaking into a sprint. The group tore through the trees, their flashlights flailing wildly. The forest seemed to shift around them, the ground rising and falling in unnatural waves. Roots tangled around their ankles, branches clawed at their faces, but they pressed on, driven by sheer panic. Behind them, the scream shifted, turning into guttural laughter. It chased them, growing louder and closer with every step. "Don't look back," Tom yelled, though he could feel the weight of something watching them, something enormous and ancient. Jake tripped, his flashlight clattering to the ground. He cried out, but Tom grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet. "Keep moving." Suddenly, the forest opened up into another clearing, this one dominated by an old, decaying cabin. Its wooden walls leaned precariously, and the windows were dark and broken. But it was shelter, a thin barrier against the horrors outside. "In there!" Sarah shouted. The group stumbled toward the cabin, their fear propelling them forward. Tom shoved the creaking door open, and they tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The cabin was stifling, the air thick with the scent of decay. Faint moonlight filtered through the broken windows, revealing walls covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen on the trees. A crude circle had been drawn in the dirt floor, surrounded by melted candles and blackened bones. "What the hell is this place?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. "Looks like someone's idea of a ritual," Tom muttered, sweeping his flashlight over the room. "But at least we're out of the open." Jake backed into a corner, his breathing ragged. "We can't stay here. That thing, whatever Marcus is now, it's out there. Where else are we supposed to go?" Sarah snapped, pacing nervously. "We're lost, the forest is alive, and..." She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. "Do you see that?" she whispered. The others turned their flashlights to where she was pointing. At first, they saw nothing but shadows. But then the shadows moved. In the corner, slumped against the wall, was a body. Its features were contorted, the skin stretched impossibly tight over bones. The eyes were open but lifeless, staring straight ahead. Claw marks crisscrossed its chest, and the symbols carved into the walls had been burned into its flesh. Jake gagged, stumbling backward. "What is this place?" Sarah knelt beside the body, her flashlight trembling. She spotted a notebook clutched in its skeletal hand. With a grimace, she pried it loose and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled as if in a frenzy. "They're inside me. The whispers won't stop. I see them in the trees, in the shadows. They want me to stay. They want me to join them." Sarah flipped to the last entry, her hands trembling. "I can't fight it anymore. The forest is in me now. If you're reading this, leave. Burn this place. Do not let it take you too." Before she could say anything, a loud thud echoed from the roof. The group froze. "What was that?" Lisa whispered. Another thud, heavier this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. "Tom," Jake's voice was barely audible. Tom raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. He crept to the nearest window, peering out into the darkness. The trees stood silent and still. But then his flashlight caught movement, a shadow that darted between the trunks, too fast to follow. And then the laughter began again, echoing from all directions. It was Marcus's voice, but twisted and wrong, filled with malice and hunger. "It knows we're here," Sarah whispered, clutching the notebook to her chest. The thuds turned into scratching, long nails raking across the roof. The sound circled above them, deliberate and taunting. Lisa began to cry, her hands pressed against her ears. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." Tom gritted his teeth, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "Whatever happens, we don't go outside. Do you hear me?" But before anyone could answer, the door burst open, and Marcus stepped inside. Marcus stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the oppressive darkness outside. His body seemed distorted, the angles of his limbs wrong, his movements unnatural. His face twisted into a smile that didn't belong to him, his teeth glinting like shards of bone in the pale moonlight. "Why did you run?" he asked, his voice layered with something inhuman, resonating deep in their bones. "The forest wants you." "Marcus," Tom said, stepping forward despite the terror clawing at his chest. He held his flashlight like a shield. "If you're in there, fight it. Whatever's happening, we can help you." Marcus tilted his head, his glassy eyes flicking to Tom. "There's no fighting it. The forest is already inside me. And now it's inside you too." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake shouted, his voice cracking. Marcus smiled wider, his jaw stretching unnaturally. He raised a hand, and the group gasped. Carved into his palm was one of the symbols they'd seen on the trees. A jagged, looping mark that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Look at yourselves," Marcus whispered, stepping further into the cabin. "You've been marked too." The group froze. Lisa instinctively clutched her arms, as though trying to shield herself. "You're lying," she stammered. "We're not." "Check," Marcus interrupted, his voice chillingly calm. "Go ahead, check." Tom hesitated, then pulled back his sleeve. His stomach dropped. Etched into his forearm, just beneath the skin, was a faint outline of a symbol. It glowed faintly, pulsing in time with his racing heartbeat. "No," he whispered, his mind reeling. He looked up at the others. "Do you?" One by one they checked. Lisa lifted her sleeve, revealing a mark on her wrist. Jake rolled up his pant leg, finding another carved into his calf. Sarah pulled at her collar, exposing a glowing symbol just above her collarbone. "It can't be real," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't happening." "It's already done," Marcus said, his voice cold and final. "You belong to the forest now. You can't leave." "Shut up," Jake yelled, his fear boiling into anger. He grabbed a metal pipe from the corner of the room and advanced on Marcus. "We'll get out of here, and you can't stop us." Marcus's smile didn't falter. He stepped forward, his movements eerily smooth. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Try." Jake swung the pipe with all his strength. It connected with Marcus's shoulder, the impact reverberating through the room. But Marcus didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't even stumble. He just stood there smiling. Jake backed away, his hands trembling. "What the hell are you?" Marcus tilted his head again, his glassy eyes fixed on Jake. "I am the forest." The room shuddered violently, the walls groaning as if they were alive. The symbols carved into the wood began to glow, their light pulsating in sync with the marks on their skin. The group clutched their heads as the whispering returned, louder and more insistent, filling their minds with a chaotic chorus of unintelligible voices. "Stop it!" Lisa screamed, collapsing to her knees. Sarah grabbed Tom's arm. "We have to get out of here. Now!" Tom nodded, his jaw set. "Through the back," he said, motioning toward a door at the far end of the cabin. "What about him?" Jake asked, gesturing to Marcus. "We leave him," Tom said grimly. "That's not Marcus anymore." The group moved quickly, their breath shallow as they edged toward the back door. Marcus watched them, his smile unwavering. "You can run," he said, "but you'll never leave. The forest always finds you." Tom shoved the back door open, revealing the dark expanse of trees beyond. The group bolted, the oppressive air of the forest immediately wrapping around them. The whispering grew louder, the voices now screaming their names, demanding they stop. They ran blindly, the terrain uneven and treacherous. Roots clawed at their feet, branches slashed at their faces, but they didn't stop. Behind them, Marcus's laughter echoed, chasing them like a predator stalking its prey. Lisa stumbled, crying out as she fell to the ground. Tom and Sarah stopped, pulling her to her feet. "Keep moving," Tom urged. "I can't," Lisa sobbed. "It's too much." "You have to," Sarah said, gripping her arm. "We're not leaving you." The group pressed on, their breaths ragged, their legs burning. The forest seemed endless, every direction the same tangle of trees and shadows. And then, through the haze of panic, they saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. "There!" Tom shouted. "Head for the light." As they neared the glow, the forest seemed to push back, the trees swaying violently, the ground trembling beneath their feet. But they pushed through, their desperation driving them forward. Finally, they burst into another clearing. In the center stood a towering bonfire, its flames casting eerie shadows across the surrounding trees. The firelight revealed a circle of figures standing silently, their faces obscured by dark hoods. The group skidded to a halt, their breaths coming in gasps. The hooded figures turned in unison, their movements unnaturally smooth. One stepped forward, lowering their hood to reveal a pale, featureless face. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice echoing in their minds. "The forest has claimed you." And as the flames roared higher, the group realized the truth. The forest wasn't just alive, it was waiting. The fire roared in the clearing, its light illuminating the hooded figures as they closed in, their pale, featureless faces reflecting the flames. The group backed away, their panic mounting. "What are they?" Lisa whispered, clinging to Sarah. Tom held up his flashlight, the beam trembling as it swept over the figures. "Stay together," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what they are, but we can't let them separate us." One of the figures stepped forward, its movements smooth yet disturbingly mechanical. It raised a hand, long and skeletal, and pointed at the group. "The forest speaks," it said, its voice hollow and resonant, as if echoing from deep underground. "You are marked. You must choose." "Choose what?" Sarah demanded, her voice tight with fear. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, the pale expanse of its face unnerving in its blankness. "One stays. The others may leave." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake shouted. He stepped forward, brandishing the metal pipe he'd carried from the cabin. "We're not leaving anyone behind." The figures didn't respond. Instead, the one in front gestured toward the fire. The flames shifted, twisting and writhing, forming shapes that flickered like phantoms. For a brief moment, the group saw their own faces reflected in the fire, each contorted in fear and pain. "The forest hungers," the figure said. "One must remain to feed it. The others will be free." "This is insane," Lisa said, shaking her head. We can't decide that." Tom's mind raced, his heart pounding. He turned to the others. "There has to be another way. We stick together. We fight if we have to." "Fight them," Jake snapped, gesturing to the figures. "Did you see what Marcus turned into? We can't fight the forest." Sarah's eyes darted between the fire and the figures. Maybe they're lying. Maybe none of us have to stay. "Do you really want to test that theory?" Jake said bitterly. The figures stood silent, unmoving, their presence pressing down on the group like a suffocating weight. The fire hissed and crackled, throwing grotesque shadows across the clearing. "I'm not staying here," Lisa said suddenly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not going to let this place take me." "No one's staying," Tom said firmly. He turned to the hooded figure. "We're leaving. All of us." The figure's hand dropped to its side. "If none are chosen," it said, its voice colder now, "the forest will choose." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The bonfire blazed higher, its flames splitting apart and snaking toward the group like living things. The whispering returned, louder and more frenzied, the voices now screaming in a cacophony of unintelligible words. Tom grabbed Sarah's arm. "Run!" They bolted toward the trees, their flashlights bobbing wildly. The hooded figures didn't follow, but their presence seemed to linger, the air heavy with their unseen gaze. The forest seemed to fight against their escape, the roots shifting beneath their feet, the branches clawing at their clothes. Behind them, the fire exploded with a deafening roar. A blast of heat surged through the clearing, knocking them to the ground. Tom scrambled to his feet, dragging Sarah up with him. Lisa and Jake were already running ahead, their forms barely visible in the dim light. "Don't stop!" Tom shouted. The forest grew darker, the whispering morphing into guttural growls that seemed to echo from all directions. Shapes moved in the periphery of their vision, tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes. The trees themselves seemed to lean toward them, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. Lisa stumbled, falling hard onto her knees. Sarah turned back, grabbing her under the arms and hauling her to her feet. "Come on, Lisa. You can do this." "I can't," Lisa sobbed. "I can't." "You have to," Sarah yelled, dragging her forward. The ground began to quake again, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing second. Behind them, the shadowy figures loomed closer, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though gliding through the trees. "We're not going to make it," Jake shouted, his voice ragged with terror. "Yes, we are," Tom yelled back. "Keep moving." And then, just ahead, they saw it, a break in the trees. Moonlight spilled through, casting a faint glow over a narrow path that stretched into the distance. It was the first clear path they'd seen since entering the forest. "There!" Tom shouted. "Head for the light." The group sprinted toward the opening, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figures behind them seemed to pause at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on the group as they burst through the trees and onto the path. The moment they crossed the threshold, the whispering stopped. The air grew still, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting slightly. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exertion and fear. For a moment, none of them spoke, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Jake broke the silence. Did we make it?" Tom sat up, his chest heaving. "I don't know, but we're not stopping here." Lisa was crying softly, her hands clutching at her arms. Sarah knelt beside her, trying to comfort her. "We're okay," Sarah said, though her voice was shaking. "We're okay." But as they gathered themselves, Tom noticed something etched into the dirt at the edge of the path. A symbol glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was the same mark carved into their skin. "The forest isn't done with us," Tom said quietly, his voice grim. "Not yet." The group staggered along the narrow path, the oppressive weight of the forest clinging to their minds and bodies. The silence was deafening now. No whispering, no growls, not even the rustle of leaves. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. "Where do you think this path leads?" Lisa asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Anywhere but back there," Jake muttered, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the trees. Tom walked at the front, his jaw set in grim determination. "We follow it until we find help, or until we're out of this forest." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, shuddering as she caught sight of the faint glow of the clearing they'd left behind. The hooded figures were gone, but their presence lingered a shadow in her thoughts. "Do you think they'll follow us?" "They didn't have to," Tom said, his voice heavy. "The forest doesn't need them to find us." Lisa whimpered, clutching her arms tighter. "I don't think we're going to get out. That thing said the forest already marked us. What if it's too late?" "Stop talking like that," Sarah said sharply, though fear laced her tone. "We're not giving up." Jake stopped suddenly, his flashlight flickering. "Wait, do you hear that?" The group froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the eerie stillness. Then, faintly, the sound came, a soft, wet squelching, like something heavy dragging itself through the underbrush. "What is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Tom motioned for the group to stay quiet as he edged forward, his flashlight aimed at the trees. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint crack of branches snapping underfoot. It was coming closer. "Stay behind me," Tom whispered, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The trees ahead shifted, their shadows twisting unnaturally. The dragging sound grew louder, almost rhythmic, and then something emerged. It wasn't Marcus. At least, not anymore. The thing that stumbled into the path had once resembled a man, but its body had been grotesquely altered. Its limbs were elongated, its skin mottled with patches of bark and moss. Glowing veins crisscrossed its face and arms, pulsating in sync with the marks etched into its flesh. Its eyes glowed faintly, blank and devoid of humanity. Lisa screamed, stumbling backward. "Oh my God! What is that?" The creature's head jerked toward her, its mouth twisting into a grotesque imitation of a smile. "Lisa!" It rasped, its voice layered and distorted. "You can't run. You belong to us." "Run!" Tom shouted. The group broke into a sprint, the creature's distorted laughter echoing behind them. The path twisted and turned, the trees pressing closer as if trying to swallow them whole. The ground beneath their feet became slick with mud, and the air grew colder with every step. Jake tripped, landing hard on his hands and knees. "Help me!" he shouted, but before anyone could stop, the creature was upon him. It moved unnaturally fast, its limbs bending in ways no human should. It grabbed Jake by the ankle, dragging him toward the trees. Jake screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the creature's grip was unrelenting. "Jake!" Tom yelled, doubling back. He grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all his strength, striking the creature across the back. The impact sent a sickening crack through the air, but the creature didn't even flinch. "Go!" Jake shouted, his voice choked with panic. "Leave me! Get out of here! We're not leaving you!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling with all her strength. The creature growled, its grip tightening. Jake's skin began to darken where the creature touched him, the veins under his flesh glowing faintly. His screams grew more frantic, his voice cracking as pain racked his body. Tom swung again, this time striking the creature in the head. It let out an inhuman screech, releasing Jake and stumbling back. Its glowing eyes fixed on Tom, filled with a primal rage. "Run!" Tom shouted. "Take Jake and go!" Sarah and Lisa dragged Jake to his feet, his weight nearly pulling them down as they stumbled forward. Tom followed, his eyes darting back to the creature, which now stood in the middle of the path, watching them. "It's not following," Sarah panted, glancing over her shoulder. "Not yet," Tom said grimly, his grip tightening on the branch. "But it will." They ran until their lungs burned, the path twisting endlessly ahead of them. The glow of the marks on their skin pulsed in time with their racing hearts, a constant reminder of the forest's grip on them. Finally, they reached another clearing. This one was smaller, less foreboding, but no less unsettling. In the center stood a gnarled tree, its trunk twisted into a grotesque semblance of a human face. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. "What is this place?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom approached the tree cautiously, his flashlight beam revealing deep carvings in its bark. The symbols were the same as those etched into their skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. Sarah knelt beside Jake, who was pale and trembling, his leg darkened where the creature had grabbed him. "We need to help him," she said, her voice breaking. "He's getting worse." Before anyone could respond, the tree let out a low groan, its twisted face seeming to shift. The group froze as the voice of the forest returned, this time coming from the tree itself. "You cannot escape," it said. "You are part of the forest now." The branches above rustled, and the group looked up to see glowing eyes peering down at them from the canopy. The forest wasn't waiting anymore. It was closing in. The glowing eyes above them blinked in unison, a silent acknowledgement of the group's presence. The tree in the center of the clearing groaned again, its twisted face seeming to shift and contort as if it were alive. "You cannot run," the voice of the forest echoed from the tree. "You cannot fight. You are already ours." Tom stepped in front of the others, gripping the branch he'd used against the creature. His hands trembled, but his jaw was set. "Stay together," he said, his voice low. "No matter what happens." Sarah knelt beside Jake, who was shivering uncontrollably. The darkened veins on his leg had spread, creeping up toward his thigh. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering. "He's getting worse," she whispered. "We need to do something." Lisa clutched her arms, tears streaking her face. "What can we do? It's not like we can call for help. We're trapped." "We're not trapped," Tom said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He glanced at the twisted tree, the glowing marks etched into its bark. "This thing is the source of it all. It has to be. You think cutting down a magic tree is going to solve this?" Jake rasped, his voice weak, but laced with a bitter laugh. "Be my guest. Do you have a better idea?" Tom snapped. The forest responded before anyone else could. The branches above rustled violently, the glowing eyes descending closer. The figures from the earlier clearing, hooded, faceless, emerged from the trees, forming a silent ring around the group. Their presence was suffocating, their blank faces tilting as if to watch. "It is time," the tree said, its voice reverberating in the ground beneath them. "One must stay. The rest will leave." Tom gritted his teeth, turning to the others. "We're not choosing anyone. If this thing wants a fight, we give it one." "Are you insane?" Lisa whispered harshly. "Did you see what it did to Marcus? To Jake? And if we give in?" Tom countered. "You think it's going to just let the rest of us go? This thing doesn't let anyone leave." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to shift, the dirt writhing as if alive. Roots erupted from the earth, coiling around their feet like snakes. Lisa screamed, trying to pull free, but the roots tightened, dragging her closer to the twisted tree. "No, let me go," she cried, clawing at the dirt. Tom swung his branch, hacking at the roots until they released her. "Get behind me," he shouted. The hooded figures began to move, their pale, featureless faces tilting as they reached out with skeletal hands. They didn't speak, but the pressure in the air grew unbearable, their intent clear. They wouldn't let the group leave. Sarah grabbed a rock from the ground, her hands shaking but determined. If they want to fight, they'll get one. The clearing erupted into chaos. Tom swung his branch at the advancing figures, but they didn't falter, their movements slow and deliberate. Sarah threw her rock, striking one in the chest, but it didn't react. The figures were relentless, closing in from all sides. Jake, still lying on the ground, groaned as the veins on his leg spread further, dark tendrils creeping up his neck. "Go," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Just leave me." "No," Sarah shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. "We're not leaving you." The tree groaned louder, its twisted face contorting in anger. "One must stay," it repeated. "The forest demands a sacrifice." Tom turned toward the tree, his flashlight beam piercing its grotesque features. "If you want someone, take me," he shouted. "Leave them alone." The hooded figures froze, their heads tilting toward the tree as if awaiting its judgment. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "No," Sarah said, standing. "You can't. Do you have a better idea?" Tom cut her off, his voice trembling. "This ends here. If it takes me to let you go, then so be it." The tree let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "You think it is so simple?" it said. "The forest is already chosen." Before anyone could react, the roots beneath Jake erupted, coiling around his body and lifting him into the air. His screams were muffled as the tendrils wrapped around his mouth, pulling him toward the tree. "Jake!" Sarah screamed, grabbing at the roots, but they were too strong. Tom and Lisa joined her, pulling and hacking at the roots with whatever they could find, but it was no use. Jake's body was dragged closer to the tree, the marks on his skin glowing brighter as the veins consumed him. "Run!" Jake choked out, his voice weak but insistent. "Run now!" The tree's laughter grew louder, the hooded figures closing in again. The forest seemed to pulse with power, the air thick with its presence. "Go!" Tom shouted, grabbing Sarah and Lisa by the arms. "There's nothing we can do." Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We can't leave him. We have to," Tom yelled, pulling her away as the tree consumed Jake, his body vanishing into its gnarled trunk. The group ran, the hooded figures giving chase. The forest came alive around them, roots and branches lashing out, but they pushed forward, their desperation driving them through the chaos. Finally, they burst through the trees and into another clearing. This one was different. A road stretched before them, the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Tom turned back, expecting to see the hooded figures, the glowing eyes, the whispers, but the forest was silent. Jake was gone, but so, it seemed, was the forest pursuit. What just happened? Lisa whispered, collapsing to the ground. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, who was staring at the glowing mark on her arm. It was pulsing faster now, brighter, as if alive. "We didn't escape," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. "Not really." The marks on all their skin flared to life, burning with an unnatural heat. The forest had claimed one, but it wasn't finished yet. The road stretched out before them, illuminated faintly by the glow of distant headlights. For the first time since entering the forest, they stood on solid, open ground, the oppressive weight of the trees momentarily lifted. But the relief was fleeting. Tom stared down at the mark on his arm. The glow, faint and pulsing, now flared brighter with each beat of his heart. Lisa and Sarah were the same. Their glowing symbols seemed to throb in unison, as though tied to the forest itself. "This isn't over," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We're still marked." Tom clenched his fists, his mind racing. "It doesn't matter. We're out. We'll find someone who can help." Lisa laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and brittle. "Help us? Who? How? Did you see what happened to Jake? This thing doesn't stop. It doesn't let go." The memory of Jake's final moments burned in all their minds. His body consumed by the tree, his screams swallowed by the forest. It wasn't just a loss. It was a warning. The forest wasn't done with them. Tom grabbed Lisa by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. We're not giving up. Whatever this is, whatever's happening to us, we fight it. Do you hear me?" Lisa didn't respond, her tear-filled eyes fixed on his. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained haunted. "Let's go," Tom said, motioning toward the headlights in the distance. "We stick to the road. Stay together. And don't stop." The three of them began to walk, their steps heavy with exhaustion and dread. The road seemed endless, stretching into the darkness like a ribbon of uncertainty. The headlights grew no closer, as though the horizon itself was retreating. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The others stopped listening. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, the whispering began again. It was different now, softer, less chaotic, but more intimate. It wasn't calling their names anymore. It was inside their heads. "You cannot leave. You are ours. The forest lives in you now." Tom clutched his head, trying to block out the voices. "Ignore it," he said through gritted teeth. "It's just trying to scare us." "It's more than that," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's in us. Don't you feel it? The marks, they're spreading." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing that the glowing symbol had grown. The lines of the mark now snaked up her arm, pulsing like veins. Lisa gasped, inspecting her own wrist and finding the same. Tom pulled back his shirt to look at his shoulder. The mark there had spread across his chest, the glow stronger now. It felt hot, as if burning into his skin. "What's happening to us?" Lisa cried, backing away. "It's not just the forest, it's inside us. We're not letting it win," Tom said firmly, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Keep moving. We'll find help." But as they walked, the marks grew brighter, the pain more intense. The whispering became louder, a constant hum in their minds. The road beneath their feet seemed to warp and twist, no longer solid but shifting like the forest floor. "Are we even on the road anymore?" Sarah asked, her voice panicked. Tom stopped, shining his flashlight down. The pavement was gone. In its place was dirt and tangled roots, the forest reclaiming its hold on them. "No tom whisper." "No, we're out. We're out." The headlights ahead flickered and disappeared, leaving them in darkness once more. The trees rose around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The forest hadn't let them go. It had never let them go. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. "I can't," she sobbed. "It's too strong. It's pulling me back." Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We're not giving up. Do you hear me? We're—" A piercing scream cut through the air. Tom and Sarah turned to see Lisa, standing frozen a few feet away. The glow of her mark had engulfed her entire body, her veins burning with the light. She clutched her head, her mouth open in a silent scream as the forest consumed her. "Lisa!" Sarah cried, rushing forward, but Tom held her back. "We can't save her," he said, his voice breaking. "It's too late." The light from Lisa's body flared one final time, and then she was gone. Nothing remained but the faint glow of her mark, now etched into the ground where she had stood. Sarah collapsed, sobbing. "It's never going to stop. We're all going to end up like her. Like Jake." Tom knelt beside her, his own mark burning brighter now. He could feel the forest inside him, a part of his very being, but he refused to give in. "No," he said quietly. "There has to be a way. We'll fight this. We'll—" The ground beneath them shifted, roots coiling around their legs. The whispering grew deafening, the forest's voice now clear and commanding. "You belong to us. There is no escape." Tom struggled against the roots, but they held fast. The glow of his mark spread across his chest, the heat searing into his flesh. He looked at Sarah, her own mark blazing as she stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "We're not going to make it, are we?" she whispered. Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. The forest's grip was unrelenting, its whispers drowning out his thoughts. As the roots pulled them down, the last thing he saw was the sky above, the stars vanishing behind the canopy of trees. And then there was nothing but darkness. Weeks later, hikers in the Appalachian Mountains stumbled upon strange carvings on a tree. The symbols glowed faintly in the dim light, etched into the bark like scars. Beneath them, in the dirt, were names scratched deep into the earth. Tom, Sarah, Lisa, Jake. The forest had claimed them, and it was waiting for more.